This is the Vanderbilt University Oral History Project concerning the early swearing in of Lamar Alexander as governor of Tennessee on January 17, 1979. Today's date is Monday, January 16, 2012, and the interview today in the Vanderbilt Library is with John J. Hooker, Jr. Mr. Hooker attended the University of the South and received a law degree from Vanderbilt University in 1957. He's a native Nashvilleian and has been actively involved in the practice of law, a number of business ventures, and in Democratic Party politics over several decades, including running for governor in 1966 and 1970. In the early 1980s, he was publisher of the Banner newspaper in Nashville. He is a direct descendant of William Blount, who signed the Constitution of the United States. And Mr. Hooker, can you begin by talking about what your day was like, the day of the early swearing in, and how you came to be involved in that?
Well, let me start by how I came to be involved in that. Lamar Alexander was Winfield Dunn's campaign manager when I ran for governor in 1970. And so he and I were unlikely political allies. He had managed the campaign of the man who beat me for governor in 1970. And so during that time of 1970, when I ran for governor, I had several people obviously involved with me in my efforts, one of whom was a man named Hal Hardin, who was had a major involvement in my campaign. It turned out that Hal Hardin, at the time of this event, the swearing in, was the United States Attorney in Nashville, and was really the key figure in this circumstance. Hal Hardin was the man who as the United States Attorney, realized that we were in deep trouble in Tennessee, and that the existing governor, Ray Blanton, was going to pardon and had pardoned several people, and he wanted to stop it. And he was the fundamental force in the event that we're just getting ready to talk about. I had helped Lamar in the campaign, despite the fact that I was a Democrat, and despite the fact that I was, so to speak, a liberal. I was a Kennedy man. I had gotten 96% of the black votes when I ran for governor of Tennessee. Had been a big opponent of the Vietnam War. Had been running mates with Albert Gore Sr. And so it was an unusual circumstance that I was, having been, by that time, there were only two of us. The governor of Tennessee in 1966 was either going to be me or the fellow who beat me, whose name was Buford Ellington, because in those times, the Republicans didn't even run anybody for governor, so the Democratic nominee automatically became governor. And then, of course, I was a Democratic nominee in 70, so on two occasions, it was either going to be me or the other guy to be governor. And I was the liberal Kennedyite, involved with civil rights. And now, all of a sudden, I get involved in the situation of being against the Democratic nominee for governor, who's a fellow by the name of Jake Butcher from Nashville, Tennessee, who was running against and did run against Lamar. Prior to that, the governor had misbehaved in several ways, the existing governor, and I had been contacted by Lamar to see if Winfield Dunn, who had been governor, the man who beat me, and I would start a group that got signatures to try to keep the governor from taking certain actions. And we did form the committee. It was a statewide committee. We did get a lot of signatures, Governor Winfield Dunn and myself. And so we were opposed to what was happening in Tennessee. He is the former governor, I as the former Democratic nominee, and as a opponent of him, were unified across party lines on the basis that what's right's right, what's wrong's wrong, and this governor of Tennessee, Ray Blanton, is misbehaving, that we don't need perpetuation of that Jake Butcher, who was running against Blanton, would not reject it. I mean, running against Lamar would not reject the conduct of Ray Blanton. Ray Blanton was supporting Jake Butcher against Lamar. And so it's through that circumstance that I got involved in trying to be of aid to Lamar, notwithstanding the fact that he was a Republican and I was a Democrat. But it all involved the question of the misbehavior of Governor of Governor Blanton.
And do you have any comments on those 52 pardons of the night?
What?
Of the 52 pardons that Blanton gave on the night of the 15th?
There was what was the name escapes me, the man's name who he was letting out. Do you recollect that? What the man, the centerpiece of the controversy, the man's name?
Roger Humphreys.
Roger Humphrey. I don't know how I forgot it. Yeah, I got very much disgusted with that circumstance that he was pardoning Roger Humphrey. That I thought that was the absolute wrong thing to do. Now, of course, as you know, that under the Constitution, the governor has the absolute power to pardon it. It's a constitutional power of the governor, and so you run abreast of the proposition that the founders put the discretion in the governor, not in those who think he's right or wrong. It's the governor's discretion. But active citizens, of which I was one, I had the right to speak up about it, and I did speak up about it. And he was the centerpiece of the effort between Governor Dunn and myself to stop that from being done. You follow me?
Yes.
Which was unsuccessful. He went ahead and did it anyway. And so it was in that climate that the whole thing evolved. That Roger Humphreys was basically the centerpiece. That argument about Roger Humphreys was basically the centerpiece of the beginning of the circumstance, it turned out. So with that in mind, I had several friendships across the political lines. Tom Ingram, who was Lamar's campaign manager, and who had formerly been worked in the newspaper business. I had been the general counsel of the Nashville Tennessean, which was owned by a man named Eamon Evans, who's unfortunately dead. But Eamon could contribute to this proposition because he was involved in that transition, and the Tennessean, of course, was watching that not by the hour or the minute, but by the second and even smaller. And I had been Eamon's lawyer, and Eamon had been supported me when I ran for governor, and so and was a great friend of mine. And so I was talking to him all the time about this circumstance, and he was a loyal Democrat, and on the other hand, he was owned that newspaper, and he had a responsibility to the public to expose the truth and tell it like it was. And Tom Ingram had been an employee of the Tennessean, and Tom Ingram was a spokesperson for and the manager of Lamar's campaign. So there was that interlocking of relationships that transcended politics, really, that became of the fact that we were of the same generation, that we had these connections with various people, and Eamon Evans was a big part of this. Sorry that he's not here to give his history about it. Getting more specific about the event itself, Tom Ingram and I were talking on a daily basis, sometimes several times a day, about the circumstance as it grew up, and I had been advised that what was happening, and as I say, Hal Hardin, who was the United States Attorney, had been a major part of my own campaign for governor, and I was very much interested in the role of the Department of Justice. It's obviously a very unique circumstance for the Department of Justice to become involved in a political transition of power in a state, and the fact is that Hal, I don't think Hal could speak. I'm sure Hal spoke for himself, and that you have an oral history of. But Hal was very courageous to do what he did. He didn't have any sanction from Washington to be a go-between and be in a situation where, in effect, he was creating a transition of political power from one governor to another. before the inauguration, and so it must be observed that he was the centerpiece of all this, and if it never would have happened without Hal Hardin. And there was then, as a consequence of his activity and his facility to advise Lieutenant Governor Wilder and to advise the Speaker, Ned McWhorter, unfortunately, as you know, both of whom are also dead, not here able to speak for themselves. But this would not have happened if they had not also shown some courage in the matter and risen to the occasion. And they put the interest of the state first. It was a very sour pill for them to go against the sitting Democratic governor, particularly one from West Tennessee who they knew and grown up with, and who had been a congressman and with whom they had many mutual friends. A lot of people were friends with Blanton and friends with Wilder and friends with McWhorter, and then for Wilder and McWhorter to be willing to use their political power to put Blanton out of office in humiliation was a major moral step for them and offended much of their relationships with people. And so it was a highly dramatic circumstance that this United States Attorney, Hal Hardin, was willing to reach out beyond his authority and based upon his own moral compass, get into this situation to effectuate a circumstance, which he did only because he was convinced that he had a duty to do so, that this fellow Blanton was going to continue to pardon people who shouldn't be pardoned or would appear shouldn't be pardoned, and maybe they were going to do it in exchange for money, and that he was doing it without outside the best interest of Tennessee. He was doing it for his own personal gratification, either because he was getting some money, or the truth is, by this time, the polls and etc., Blanton had become much offended by the fact that the people who one time, after he got elected, became a very popular governor for a while, and in the early stages, an effective governor, and had done some good things. Blanton had done some good things. And yet, at the end, he got sour, and he got contemptuous of anybody who was critical of him, and he became extremely tense and began to drink a lot. And he spent the last part of his administration highly under the influence of alcohol. To the great disadvantage of the state, and to the even greater disadvantage of himself and his family. He had a brother who had been a high stepper and who had been a big part of his administration, who had gotten the reputation of being a bagman and who had sold various political power to various people for money. And there was a great deal of criticism about his brother. And his brother ultimately went to the penitentiary, as you know. And Ray was situated that he was intoxicated. His own brother was misbehaving. His own brother was in good measure an instigator of the problem. In other words, the alcohol and his brother's character mixed together with this political power. The trouble with Ray Blanton is that he had gone beyond the Peter principle. He had gotten to a level of power which he was emotionally and intellectually incapable of managing. He had been a relatively good congressman, a relatively in that role without the enormous power of the governor to patronage-wise to provide for contracts and business with the state and all that. When Ray Blanton got into that higher position of power, he lost the way, and he didn't have the facility to deal with that, and so he acted out this circumstance that led to this this debacle. And Lamar had wanted to be governor. He had run for governor unsuccessfully in the Watergate year. When the year he ran for governor, he had no chance to run. It was predestined. There was nothing he could do about it. The winds of politics are so dramatic. Pardon the personal reference, but I think it puts it all in context. I had lost the governor's race to Winfield Dunn in 1970. He was the first governor in decades and decades to be elected as a Republican. They didn't even run anybody for governor in those days. Up to when I lost in '66, before Ellington, the man who beat me, the governor, the Republicans didn't even run anybody 4 years before. And so then they did run somebody in 1970, and I had the unfortunate circumstance of the Democratic Party was divided 50-50 between Ellington on one side, the conservative, old-fashioned segregationist, a friend of Lyndon Johnson's, who was president of the United States, on the one hand, and I was a Kennedyite. Bobby Kennedy and I were best friends. I had worked in the Kennedy administration. Had been lived at Bobby's house, was a young liberal, a Kennedyite, was friends with Martin Luther King. I was on the liberal side of it. We had this big clash between the conservative side of the Democratic Party and the liberal side of the Democratic Party. And as a consequence of that, when I beat the conservative side in the primary, they couldn't wait to turn around and vote for Winfield Dunn to be governor of Tennessee, to beat me in the general election. And Lamar managed Winfield Dunn's campaign. So he was there at the moment in which he had the benefit of the wind being at his back. His man, Winfield Dunn, got to be governor because of the political winds that were so extreme based upon the factional fights in the Democratic Party. Now, Winfield goes and serves, and the truth about it is Winfield was a good governor. But under those days, you couldn't run for re-election. And if he could have run, Winfield would have run for re-election, but Winfield would have probably lost too, because the vicissitudes of politics. Richard Nixon was the president of the United States. Watergate had occurred, and if Winfield had run in '70, he'd have probably gotten a dose of it, just like Lamar got a dose. There was nothing that Lamar could have done to have been elected in that year, 1974. So now it's 1978, and the winds have changed back. And Lamar is situated where the Democrats have had this Ray Blanton be governor, and Ray Blanton has managed to alienate the people of Tennessee. They had an attractive, a good-looking fellow named Jake Butcher from Knoxville, Tennessee, who was had a certain charisma, but he had been heavily involved in the banking business and gotten involved in questionable financial deals. Ultimately, ended up going to penitentiary. Jake Butcher did, but all that was brewing, deeply brewing, in the course of this campaign. And so Lamar got elected and couldn't get elected in '74 because the winds were all against him, and by '78 the winds were for him. And so that switcheroo is an important part of the history of Tennessee, how that happened, how Lamar lost, and then how he won. And then how I ended up on Lamar's side, because the moral question was so overwhelming. You just couldn't tolerate this blatant conduct and so forth. So then we get down to the more specifics of when the time came. And I learned about it through Ingram, who told me, look, this thing is getting to a high point of controversy, and Hal Hardin's gotten interested in this, and we don't yet know where he's going to go, and nor do we know what we want to do, or is there anything we can do that anything we should be doing. There was a deep ambivalence at that point as to whether or not it was in Lamar's best interest to be early sworn in. It was not a pleasant thing for Lamar. He, of course, can and will speak for himself about that, but I know for it was obvious that it was not no fun thing for him. I was there at the swearing in. Ingram called me about 2:00 in the afternoon and said, "Look, meet me at the courthouse, meet me at the Supreme Court building at I think 4:00 or 5:00, whenever the moment came." And there were a certain few of us who had been involved in the situation who went to the early swearing in and they had, of course, McWhirter was there and Wilder was there, and it was a moment of high drama, but it was saturated in pain. It was not a glorious moment. It was a painful moment, and Lamar Alexander, above all else, is a decent man. He's a man that I greatly admire and respect. Even though if you took his voting record as to how he has voted in the United States Senate and how I would have voted if I had had his place, there's probably a wide divergency between him and me. But he is an honest man, and he is an intelligent man, and he is a gentleman, and so I've always had great respect for him and affection for him, despite the fact that the rascal managed the campaign against me. You with me?
I was going to ask you just to talk a little bit more about, do you think that there have been things that have not been, parts of this story that have not been told about the early swearing in, or, excuse me, things that you've uncovered in the years since the early swearing in that have to do with this story?
Well, give me a lead. Do you have some specifics in mind? I only
just
know
about. Go ahead.
I only know what I know, and I happen to be peculiarly in the situation of being friends to both sides and having access to both sides and wanting to see the right thing done. And I was concerned beyond the politics. I'm a lover of the Constitution. I'm a friend of the Constitution. You mentioned talking about me that William Blount I started learning about William Blount when I was 5 years old. And he signed the Constitution of the United States, but more importantly, or equally as importantly, he was the president of the Constitutional Convention of Tennessee of 1796. And if you haven't been over to Knoxville, to the Blount Mansion, you should go, and you should go into the room there where the Tennessee Constitution was basically written, in that room, not at some great place, but in a man's house. The main force of the Constitution was put in there. And there was so much of the Constitution, Tennessee Constitution, that was lifted from other states as a consequence of Blount's connection with these other states. Benjamin Franklin, and he had been in that convention in Philadelphia, and there's a lot in the Tennessee Constitution that came out of Pennsylvania and so forth. And so Blount, I had learned about Blount from the time I was 5 years old, and it made me, my mother taught me about Blount and made me have a great respect for the Tennessee Constitution. And of course, ultimately, it was a constitutional question here about this early swearing in. The Constitution provides for one thing, and the question is, could you go and do what ultimately happened? What was the constitutional consequences of that? Was everybody just going to close their eyes to the Constitution and act like it wasn't there, or was it going to be what was going to be happen about that? So that was a big factor in and of itself, and so as I say, there was no glory in this for Lamar. This was an unpleasant step. It so happens that it turned out that it never became. The people of Tennessee took it and absorbed it, and did not contest it. Did not. They felt it was justified, and the Tennessean newspaper and others, the Tennessean, for example, could have made a stink about this, because they were a Democratic newspaper. They could have, but it didn't happen. The higher ground overcame, and Lamar was the beneficiary of that, and in good measure the instigator of that, and the instigator in the sense that it was obvious that Lamar wasn't doing this for some self-aggrandizing reason. That was going to be some big feather in his cap, that he was doing this because it was required to be done. And so there's an awful lot about this, of course, that I don't know. All I know is what I do know, and that I was there at this moment of great drama in which people conducted themselves in a very high-minded way. Not only the Tennessean John Siegenthaler, and I'm sure he'll give testimony. And he, of course, was so close to Amen, was the editor of the newspaper. He'll know an awful lot about this. Of course, Tom Ingram was at the absolute center of it. There's no such substitute for good in politics, for good instincts. That's a great political credential, is to have good instincts. And Tom Ingram has good instincts. And so that's so important. And then, of course, the ultimate thing in politics or in life is good judgment. There's no substitute for having good judgment. Being brilliant is a great advantage. It's wonderful to be smart, but there's no substitute for common sense, because common sense tells you what the judgment should be. When you get all these formulas and all the intellectual brilliance, then when it gets down to either or dichotomy, the common sense is so important. Tom Ingram has been blessed with great common sense, and politically, he's probably the most successful political brain that we've had in Tennessee in my lifetime, the 50 years in which I have been personally involved in it. And Lamar has got good judgment. Lamar's not that his judgment always agrees with my judgment, but he knows what he's doing and why he's doing it, and he does it he has a rudder. He deals from a point of view of having a rudder. So and that applied so much in the conduct of these two men who made this big decision to do something that defied the laws of gravity. In this life, it's when you decide that you're going to defy the laws of gravity, you're making a very big decision. And they'd made a decision to defy the laws of gravity, and they did, and successfully so.
Okay. Do you have any other stories, anecdotes from that time, that day?
Watching the clock, realizing that the time was ticking, and that we're getting to a point of no return. They either did or didn't, and of course there was such activity. I talked to Ingram several times during that day, and he was so deeply engrossed in it, and it was such a hard question. What do I do? Don't we have a duty to do this? But Lamar doesn't want to do it, and it's not the seemly thing to do. It's a hard way to start a new administration and that sort of thing. So I recollect. I can even remember where I was sitting. Isn't that funny? After all that, but it's 33 years ago or whatever. Right now, this is the 17th, 16th. Yeah, it was the 17th. So 33 years ago, I can remember the chair I was sitting in, and talking on the phone to Ingram and rubbing and thinking, what should we do? What is the right thing to do about this? And then it took on a life of its own. That Ned McWhirter and John Wilder were essential ingredients in this. And I can remember calling up Ned's office and saying to him, "Look, I don't want to stick my nose in something that's none of my business, but I just want you to know that as a Democrat, that I think this is the thing to do. That we should proceed with this." And I didn't talk to Ned on that day, but I did leave word that I was believed that it should be done. I've been what I'm now getting ready to say is basically hearsay, but I talked to Ned about it subsequently, and there were several conversations, of course, between him and John Wilder about it, and it's a darn shame that, for the sake of history, and also a shame because they were good fellows. I'm sorry they're gone, but it'd be so good to have that was. They had to ultimately acquiesce in this. Without them, it wasn't going to happen. and they were getting this prodding from Hal Hardin. And I can't overstate the courage it took and the audacity it took for Hal Hardin to do this. I mean, he had no authority to do this from the Department of Justice. The big government Washington wouldn't say go doing this. He was doing this on his own. He was winging it, and effectively. And my conversations with him over the years, not too long ago, I wanted to see his oral history. He's given one, you know. I wanted to get it and refresh my recollection about it. And I would, after this is over, like to refresh my recollection by looking at it and seeing. I talked to him about it a couple of days ago, and he hadn't seen his oral history either. But basically, I've told you what I know.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.